Good morning, folks. My name's Tod Frye. I worked at Atari. I wrote the Pac-Man cartridge, which I will go on record as saying is much better than history has recorded. It's actually really interesting to look back. And I know that one of the things that the four of us lived through, and in some ways the four of us is a perfect set, because out of the dozens of programs we had at Atari, the four of us formed a real band of brothers. God, I hate that phrase. But a real bond. One of the things that's really important about the history of Atari is that pretty much everything significant we were doing was being done for the first time ever, and no one knew what the heck they were doing. And that goes all the way up to the CEO of Warner Brothers, all the way down. Well, okay, the janitors knew what they were doing, but all the way down to us. No one.
Parents didn't know what they were doing.
It's hard to tell. That may not have been at fault there. The story there is around 2 a.m, maybe in '83 or so. A security guard came in a lab, and there's some guy with some crystalline white powder laid out on a counter there, and the security guard reported him. So they got the security guard positioned in a different building. Fact is, Rob and I had the Doper Den office, literally just fired up joints right in our office. I don't know how we made the transition from sneaking around to just blowing dope right at our desks, but it happened one day, and there was no going back. The thing that I want to get across is something like E.T. E.T. is actually probably the first ever blockbuster to movie conversion that was ever attempted. Except for Raiders. It's a good thing we got Howard here. See how Raiders, it's another really interesting is what history has recorded as a massive flops gain far more attention than moderate successes or even substantial successes, which is interesting. But it's Pac-Man was it was the second probably after Space Invaders, but it was one of the first significant popular coin-op to Atari 2600 conversions. Dude, honestly, I think it's fine, right? Obviously, I would have fixed it if I didn't think it was fine. I mean, geez. But what am I getting at? It's really interesting. I'm not necessarily getting at anything, folks, so enjoy yourselves or not. What can I do? I'll pass it on to Bob or Rob or Howard pretty soon.
Keep rolling.
I was young. I worked incredibly hard. I had a great time. We did amazing stuff. I look back there and I go, if I'd only made a black background with a blue baize on it, 3/4 of the criticism probably would have disappeared. But no one knew. I didn't know. No one knew what was significant back then. It just never. Actually, Atari had a rule against black backgrounds because it would burn the maize into the phosphor of your color TV. So we weren't supposed to use black backgrounds. I truly wish I had. But the game I wrote that I am most ashamed of is Swordquest.
You're the one.
Swordquest Fireworld. That really blows. It really blows. I've just banged it out. Oh my God. It's there's a lot about Swordquest I'm very, very proud of. Howard and I were doing a thing where we were trying to take more intellectual games. Swordquest is based on the Kabbalah. It's based on a Grail quest. It's got more literary content than most games had at the time. We were trying to take these sophisticated games, and merge them with Twitch games at the same time, so that you played both adventure and breakout at the same time. And I think it was a worthwhile endeavor. It was totally a direction to go. But I just banged that game out so fast. I didn't tune any of the games. I also...
Really fast?
Really fast. I also got seduced by technology. And Swordquest, I built the Twitch games all on the somewhat renowned red-blue kernel that I wrote for Rob Zdybel's football one day in February of 1982.
Oh, always let Tod write all my kernels. It was the hard part of working anyway.
Well,
That's not quite true. I wrote
that's
a few
not quite
kernels.
true. He wrote his simpler kernels. It was so fun. And it's really, I don't know, okay, I've now talked long enough to have lost focus.
It started out pretty unfocused, I thought.
Now, Rob,
Meanwhile,
be careful. Meanwhile, back at the introduction, we are the heavy-duty pot-smoking crew from the early 80s at Atari. That's Tod and Bob and Rob and Howard. And we smoked right in mine and Rob's office. And we wrote some amazing code and some beautiful products. So,
Maybe not. I'm not
I only slept for about 5 hours last night. I'm going to turn you over to Bob.
Hi, I'm Bob Smith. I came to Atari, I was 30. These punks were like 23. They were just out of school, and I was 30, had some gray hair, so I did a cartridge, and they made me a supervisor. But first, I gravitated toward the office with the funny smell coming out from under the door, and learned an amazing amount from these two guys. Howard came along a little later, but he was obviously on the same beam as we were. So I did video pinball for Atari, and then I left and co-founded a company called Magic, where I did Dragonfire and J-Rillo the Sphinx. There's probably 6 or 8. I did a Star Wars arcade conversion. That's probably one of the better known ones. And then I've been in the business ever since. So I've been around the block. You know, I've been to EA and 3DO and Accolade for a number of years, and a little contracting here and there. And we did. Then later on, Seamus Blackley. I don't know if you know him. He's an Xbox. He was one of the guys who pushed the Xbox at Microsoft. He decided, gee, it'd be really cool to get all these ex-Atari programmers together. So he got 13 of us together. Rob and I and Dennis Coble were probably the only consumer, meaning we did console work, and the rest were coin op. But that's what I've been doing, even though I haven't been paid for a couple of years. I'm still playing with that. On to Rob.
Oh, okay.
I'm not going to ramble.
That was a good ramble. I thought it was a good ramble.
I ramble way better than Bob.
I'm Rob Zdybel. I'm much more obscure than any of these three wonderful gentlemen. And I basically was the guy who got stuck staying at Atari forever. So I did a lot of work for Atari, and when they folded, I was there, and I worked for the Tremels. And I've seen all different flavors of Atari. If you got questions about Atari, I divide it into 4 eras, and I'm happy to talk about the 4 different eras with you. There was early Atari, when the parking lot was full on Saturday and pot smoking in the office and all that crap they want to talk about. And it was a very creative environment, incredibly lush creative environment, because the execs had no clue where the money was coming from, man. They had no idea what made games successful or how they were even made. They put us in a building and let us do what we pleased. There was no interference, and the result was the incredible plethora of creativity you see, which I see now echoed, by the way, on the pad environment, with all the indies that are able to get into the market, and also on Steam, and all the people coming into PC. I'm very excited about that. And then you have early Atari, which was when the management kind of woke up and said, well, we really need to interfere with these guys. We spent enough time. Those are the guys that snorted the coke, man. The guys in the exec offices. Holy shit. And we were pretty lightweight compared to them. We didn't go into the chemical stuff, most of us. And that's when they decided they need to get their fingers in the pie and start screwing around, and effed over what would have been your next great video game, which would have been the Atari 800. That was our next-gen video game machine, which was online in 1979. We were ready to roll it out to you in 79. Oh, no, the execs couldn't have that. They're idiots. We're going to compete with IBM, if you haven't heard that story.
It's a small business machine. We've heard it.
Yeah, we're not going to go down there, but that's the early Atari era. Okay? And then people start mass defecting, and the 2600 defections caused the collapse of the market. And then you have the late Atari era, where after the first market collapse, and these start getting really crazy, and we start getting memos about worrying about, literally we got a memo telling us to conserve on paper clips and staples, because as one wag pointed out, listen, Atari Warner $20 million in the red last year. And so we could lay off one employee and get that back. I know a guy who made 22 million last year. That would be CEO of Time Warner. Just get rid of him. We're 2 million in the black, but you want to lay off. Yeah. Okay. So that was late Atari, and that was the end of Warner Atari about 1990. What was it? 1984, wasn't it? Yeah, it was 84 when Trammell's took over Atari, and then you have Trammell Atari. That's the fourth era. Okay, and actually Trammell Atari was a breath of fresh air. They were much, much, much better management than Warner had become. But they were not, of course, anything like the old days where we sat around the jacuzzi and invented games. So that's about, you know, the scope of my career. That's probably going to be interesting to you. You know, I went out with Bob. We're still making games. Just so we could chat on Friday afternoons. You know, we call up and we're designing games. We've got a handful of games. If you've got a publisher, actually, I think we're still contractually bound to Seamus. I don't know. Anyway, yeah. And the other thing is, I come to these because I learned stuff too. And I learned today that Bob was my supervisor.
Yeah, that's how easy it was.
I didn't know that.
Hello. I'm Howard Scott Warshaw. I did Yar's Revenge. I did Raiders of the Lost Ark. I did Saboteur. I also did a game called E.T., which I make no representation that's any better than any of the critical feedback it's had. And so, yeah, I had a great time at Atari. I had a great time with these guys. I felt a little abandoned when Bob left to go form a Magic, because we had formed quite a bond. And that's what I've been working in and out of games, in and out of creativity, all over technology and all different kinds of things for over 3 decades. I have still never found a collection of talent like we enjoyed in that beginning time at Atari. It was just an amazing collection of fascinating people. And the thing about it was that everyone there was very astute technically. They were also extremely creative, and they also had some other interest. Nobody was one-dimensional. It was all of these super creative, multi-dimensional people, and that's what you needed. If you want to try and define a new medium, which is the way I've always looked at what we did, we pioneered a new medium for the first time really since television. And that was pretty exciting. That was a pretty exciting place to be for me. And I got to finally find a crew of people I could really feel, you know, kinship with, which for me was a very difficult thing to find. Atari was the first time I found a place I thought, oh, I'm home. You know, these are my people. And we just fit well together. And despite the efforts of management or other groups at times to come in and really restructure or shift or insert themselves into the process, for the most part, we really managed to hold on to an amazing environment. And, you know, and my journeys have taken me into all different kinds of endeavors, and now I'm actually a psychotherapist. I've actually made the transition from programmer to therapist, which a lot of people think is an odd transition, but I don't. I think it's a very natural thing, because the way I look at programmers and therapists is we're all systems analysts. It's just that I moved on to more complicated hardware. And so, but in the big picture, the way I look at it is I used to entertain nerds, and now I try to actually make their lives better. Whereas Bob and Rob, my hat's off, you guys are still entertaining.
Well, trying to.
And Todd is entertaining in so many different dimensions.
You guys probably have more questions than we have interesting things to say.
And we'll try to come up with interesting answers.
I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there's an ongoing campaign for the Quest series, the Earth World, Water World, Fire World, to get back the sword and the crown and so on back to the hands of gamers. Is there any possibility of that happening if a Kickstarter was involved or some sort of contest? Or are they gone forever?
Huh? No, I mean, believe me, I know the Swordquest concept of bringing together DC Comics and Franklin Mint, because we were all under the Warner Brothers umbrella, was my concept from soup to nuts, basically. It just went bang, bang, bang. And the whole sketch of what Swordquest was, of the mythic journey, the Grail quest, the hero's journey from thief to wizard. it's just popped straight out of normal mythic HeroQuest literature. I mean, it's not like I invented it. Our culture sculpted it over tens of thousands of years. It was just there to be repurposed. But all that stuff between, that was all suity stuff. You'd have to find suits. Only suits know where the sword is. By which I mean is that it's an executive thing. I assume, I don't know that the sword was ever property of Atari, right? It was all a Warner Brothers thing. I really don't know. So there would be a thought that somewhere there was a vault somewhere in Sunnyvale, an Atari vault with a $50,000 jeweled sword and crown, and that when the Tremels took over, they secreted those away like, Nazi treasure or something. I don't really know. Rob laughs. But really, honestly, none of us would have any visibility into, knowledge of, or awareness, unless they were displaying the sword during Tremel Atari in the offices, which I don't think
You guys
so.
want to hear about the transition from old Atari to Tremel Atari? It was very interesting. I was one of the few employees retained when Tremels came through, and it was like Nazi treasure. I mean, you go into the exec buildings, and they'd have offices like you couldn't believe, with gold-plated toilet fixtures right there on their office, and their secretary had more electronics than your poor team could get to do their work. And in the closet, they would have stacked piles and piles of 850 interface boxes they were particularly fond of. Now, why they wanted 850, they have no use for it, but they knew that 850 interface boxes were rare and in high demand. So they kept, each one had like a dozen in their closet. It was like we had mounds and mounds of Atari gear warehouses full of stuff that was left behind. And one of the things we had to do was go through this. And boy, we had some nice offices when we were done, let me tell you.
So I do want to say though, if there was a way to do a Kickstarter to try and launch this project, I think the way to do it would be to actually do a homebrew 2600 cart that's about the story of trying to recover anything from the Warner environment. To have the title for it though, would be the 5th cart in the series. It would be What a World.
Ooh, that's harsh.
What a world.
Or Raiders of the Lost Sword.
I don't want to muddy the water here because I only know hearsay, but I've heard that those were actually destroyed. The gentleman back there.
Yes. The prizes for the Swordquest series are like extremely grandiose and elaborate and expensive. What gave you the idea to do that?
The fact that Franklin Mint, which makes these valuable collectibles, was a corporate cousin through the Warner Communications umbrella. DC Comics and Franklin Mint were owned by our owner, just an alignment of the skills of the three companies, it made sense to me. And then because we were trying to make it was that particularly Atari netted $600 million or something. So it's not the cost was no object, but $25,000 is basically nothing. I mean,
That's what they paid engineers.
in the face, that's what they paid engineers. In the face of what an advertising campaign is like, it was, if they were not in the scope of, we were coming off of games like Pac-Man, which had been selling hundreds of millions of dollars worth, regardless of what people say about it. Yes, I have an attitude about it. It didn't seem like a disproportionate expense at all if we were going to be able to contribute to the commercial success of the product. And they were grossing $25 per cart. I've been told that basically that's Nolan Bushnell's stroke of genius, was to just charge what the market would bear instead of a percentage markup. So where a ROM cart might cost $5, and normal markups back then, you'd be retailing it for $15. He said, heck, people pay $40 for this. I'm going to mark it up 10x, why 3x, right? And keep all of it, so he was selling for $25, which means he only had to sell 1,000 carts to pay for a $25,000 prize.
Went to Atari, but that's again, I was a programmer.
Yeah, that's...
They did actually have a big push on this cross-corporate thing. They came down to several meetings with us saying, we want you to use Warner properties. And has anyone ever seen Stunt Cycle? Yeah, okay, does Stunt Cycle ever get out as a cartridge? It really, because there was no release from House, I don't think deliberately. Okay, so Stunt Cycle was laying around, and I'm not gonna name the guy who did it, Bob Flower, he's a good guy, he did a good job.
He's a good guy.
And we're at one of these damn meetings, and I shout, I have this brainstorm something, because we're talking to the TV guys, and I say, Dukes of Hazzard, this is perfect. Well, Stunt Cycle tests for shit, we're not gonna release it, we'll just change the graphics, it'll be Dukes of Hazzard, what a great idea. And the next day, some exec, it was his idea, and so they made him change the graphics, and it was a turd too. Did the re-graphic version of that ever get out?
Yeah. But that's,
You guys know more about what got in the field than I do.
But to answer the original question, in some ways, I think the motivation behind doing it was to try and find a way to get people to want to buy the series.
no, that's, I would actually, in my original conception, it wasn't that. It was really going for not like a tie-in, it wasn't gratuitous, it wasn't, oh, we're gonna slap another name on it. It was part of a vision of not even multimedia, but between video game, comic book, and actual precious, real, honest-to-God artifact. It was a multimedia, it was a cultural event is what I intended it to be when I designed it.
I'm certainly glad you guys did it. It made it stand out a lot.
Yeah, it's quite unique, isn't it? Well, we were trying a lot of things, throwing shit at the wall to see what stuck.
Most of these games are kind of famous for one person designing them, but back when you had more than one person, before there was source code management, how did you?
They were one-person designs. What happened was you had all these people, all these geniuses in the lunchroom talking about the Russian Revolution and botany and space exploration all in about 30 seconds. And they were all contributing to each other's games. You walk in the guy's office and go, this is crap, but if you flipped it, it might be interesting, and you'd flip it and it'd be interesting, I mean, it was just this soup of all these people and CoinOp was downstairs, we had access to all those people coming up and playing our games and saying, no, it's shit. That's what drove it, but it was a one-person effort. And as a designer, for years I had the ethic that I 51% control ownership of the game, I demand it. It's gone now, and that's why the games you see are all watered down, corporate, Dead Space, another shooter. That's because the guys with the creative vision don't have control anymore. But we did, and so the person you see on that game that claims the credit for it, that was their vision. They did that. If they decided that someone probably said flipping the screen make this stupid game better. If they decided to flip the screen, that was their vision to actually do that, and they actually did the work. It was all what they wanted to see in the game. And you hear a million suggestions, a million, and maybe 10 of them are good, or you think are good. You're probably throwing away a lot of good ones too. That's your problem.
Well, there was an evolution over the 5 years we were there. At the beginning was exactly what Rob is saying. In order to design a game, you had to code it, right? And only one person ever worked on one code base. So it was, you did the kernel, you actually did the graphics, you designed the game, you made the audio. You'd borrow snippets of code from other people, find the 12-character kernel, what have you, character set, and it was one man, 6 months, one product, soup to nuts, everything. Then we brought in artists, which was a revolution. Then we actually hired a guy who helped with the audio. And then GCC did this thing that was very different. What GCC did is they had a display driver writer, a guy who would code the display. Basically had nothing to do with the gameplay, except that what you could get the screen to do affected what you could get the game to do. And then another guy who wrote the gameplay. That's all. And that is actually the first 3 steps to where we are now, where you didn't actually have to be able to code to design a game. But for the time that we were there, in order to design a game, you had to write the code.
I used to piss the execs off because one of my favorite things to do is because you could. They couldn't live without you. So in middle era, after early Atari, when they started coming around your office, I would literally stand up and dust the chair, say, here it is, here's the computer, here's the chair. You just code it up. If you want to see it different, just code it any way you want it, man.
Rob was much kinder than I was. I used a bullwhip sometimes. That was a fun hobby.
We're here.
Like a bullwhip.
A related question. Today we're dev environment and interact with
Okay,
all-
wait, I gotta step, I'm gonna let you guys
Notepad.
take the mic, but I've gotta step in here because you guys don't know what spoiled is. No, you don't know.
It was
Because
uphill both ways.
when we started, we worked with a tool called a 1611A logic analyzer. Right?
The best tool for the
And
job.
if, I don't know how many of you guys out there make your living cutting code, but debugging code is a pain in the ass. And it's what you spend way too much of your time doing. I told my boss one time, I told Leonard Trammell, in fact, yeah, Leonard, you pay me to make mistakes and then fix them. And the great thing with 1611A is you can trigger on any event that crosses the bus. Yeah, you got that weird write of 0 to somewhere in that bunch of memory somewhere? Yeah, you just trigger on a write of 0 to anywhere in that range on the bus. And then you can see the preceding 64,000 instructions. Pretty nice. Now, if you're working, I grant you, we're working in assembly language and we're comfortable in that and our projects are small. So this tool is like, it just sheds like you can't believe. It makes debugging a snap. If you can identify what the problem is, you can solve it because you know what's going across the bus. Just ask when it happened. And you needed it too because we had to time these things. And the 1611A would also allow you to time, it would allow you to time the length of your kernels accurately. So, I mean, that was the great tool. But other than that, no, stone knives and bearskins.
Pretty much code editing was done in the equivalent of Notepad, and it was just run from the command line to run in assembly.
I was going to say,
And then we
it
had
was
to
a line editor. It was worse than a visual editor. We had
VI.
to say, move the cursor forward 3 characters, delete 2, and then print the whole line so I can see what the heck I've done, because you couldn't see any of it on the screen. It was all on the
Though
teletype.
then, in fairness, we switched to these VAX machines that we were time sharing, and they had a word processor, I forget its name, where it kept a record of your keystrokes. So essentially you had a kind of source control, because you could always roll back to any previous point in your edit session for the last 6 months, which was kind of cool. But the 1611A was it was the silver bullet of 6502 development.
Well, we finally went to in-circuit emulators at Magic, and that was pretty special after the Atari debugging equipment. So we could capture a heck of a lot of stuff real time. Of course, when you stop at 2600, right, you just get streaks on the screen. You really can't stop and say, oh, yeah, where is that pixel? Well, it's gone now.
Never to be seen again, sometimes, thank God.
Oh, we got a lot more questions.
Get this guy in the back.
Okay, you call him. Call him out. I don't
Way in
know.
the back there.
Well, I was just going to do a quick corollary to that. Most of my experience has been like using Visual Studio. And so there's this famous photo or something of Howard Scott Warshaw. You're making ET, and I have no idea how you can even code on the screen you were coding on. So I just want to say, as a modern day software engineer, I really appreciate you guys, the skills you guys have for what you guys do, because I was really impressed that I looked at that photo for a while trying to figure out what in the world you were even doing, and I couldn't. So I just want to say kudos to that.
Well, just so you'll know, the thing on the desk just over my cigarette was a 1611A. There was a 1611A there on the lower level. On the upper level, there was the box that we had, which was the emulation box that we would put together the code, download it into there, it would run a simulator that we could interrupt. And so we could watch all this stuff go. And then there was like a little pseudo-computer that we used to actually do the code and throw it into the emulator. When I first started working there, we were using 8-inch floppies.
Right.
And that was a step up from the teletypes.
I never saw a teletype. I only saw the M3As and 8-inch floppy, and that was it. You archived your code. It was your code. If you cared about it, archive it, man. There was no. Everyone you see as a self-starter. We're complaining about one of our friends. His crazy still self-starting at 65 plus. That was what it took. You basically came into the shop. They gave you the manual, said, look, here's the dev system, you know how to code, right, kid? We wouldn't have hired you otherwise, and knock yourself out. And everyone was like a kid in a candy store, wow, I get to make a game, and wow, and here's the hardware manual, let's go. And, programming has changed a lot over the years. I can't program anymore, really, because I have an intolerance for other people's code that verges on, my doctor says, don't. So, when
Practically Zdybel-esque.
when I'm standing on top of someone else's code, I have a problem working with Unity, I don't like it. It doesn't do what I want to do. It's not, I didn't write it. It's not good. But what I really, really, really enjoyed about the business, to be more positive, is dancing on the naked iron, which we got to do. That was really fun. That was my funnest part of the job, was being right down on the hard iron. Because the thing would happen is, like, Rob Fulop comes in one day and says, oh, I got this. Look what I've made the iron do. I've got an idea for a game. Demon Attack is born. You know?
But then again, another way to look at it, so we're doing 4K ROMs, 32,000 bits. So it's 32,000 bits in 6 months. I don't want to do the math right now, but that's something like every hour we had to figure out what a bit was going to be. I mean, you could almost do it by flipping a coin if you were very, very lucky.
That's not true at all.
And another way to look at it is, those
I know,
games, that's a long time ago, right? So it was 4K of code and 128 bytes of RAM, for all of your memory needs. But nowadays, most of your data structures are bigger than 4K, right? So you have single data structures. And back then it was absurd also. Like, I heard a presentation from Eugene Jarvis, who I think is probably the greatest game designer ever. I think he's just amazing.
Still one of the best.
And he was doing a presentation on Robotron. And he's sitting there talking about how his audio processor, just the audio processor, had 128 bytes of RAM and 2K of ROM. And like, that was our whole game. He had that just for his audio processor, and that was at the same time that we were doing 2600 games. So the life of the 2600 was amazing, right? Because a game that was a machine that was invented to do very few, very simple games.
Combat.
And really, and about 6 other games. That was the concept for it, because it was interchangeable games. And if you had 6 of them, that's like a world, because nobody had ever done an interchangeable game. But what that machine turned out to be capable of far exceeded the designer's concepts and expectations, but it took people who would get involved with it and tweak it and play with it in ways nobody conceived. And there's also the whole theory about how cost reducing the machine made it better. Usually when you cost reduce stuff, it loses features. But somehow when we cost reduced, or when 2600 was cost reduced, they ended up taking out a lot of the automatic stuff that would channel how you have to use the hardware. And it left an opportunity for creativity that doesn't exist quite as much. There's always opportunities to apply creativity to hardware, but it was a whole new thing to do that. And it took people like this to really show not just you and the people there, but each other. Like, holy crap, I never would have thought the machine could go that far in that direction. And it was inspiring. It was inspiring to see people on a regular basis come up with stuff that was just like, wow.
Well,
That was a cool place to work.
It was, and they take it beyond. It's a 6-character moving kernel. You see that? I saw it when I came into the shop. That was Rick Mauer's invention. Brilliant. I think Carol Shaw helped him on that. And you go, wow, who would have thought that you could get a 2600 to do that? Like a couple of years later, this guy's writing the interleave threaded interpretive kernel, that's basically a 4th program running in your kernel. It's like, people.
It was very cool.
It was cool. It was very cool.
But then again, just to be fair, there was an awful lot of stuff you could not get a 2600 to do no matter what.
No.
But
So
you
there
never
was
saw
stuff.
any of that in a game.
You never saw any of that in a game. So it was, really what was supposed to happen is the guys, Joe DeCure, whatever, I think he's speaking later, who designed the 2600, freaking brilliant, amazing piece of hardware, designed the 400 and 800 chipset to replace it as a consumer console circuit, and it was supposed to be in the market around 81. Now, this is an example of way back to what Howard and I were talking about last night. It was the first time anyone had done any of this stuff, and corporate management had no idea how long you could get a console to last. The engineers apparently were smarter than the C-level executives, because they were going, dude, you need a new console pretty soon. And management was going, we're going to milk this cash cow for another 5 years. If history would be completely different if we had shipped, well, I don't know, not completely.
Well, a company like Nintendo came
We
and ate that much. Did I see
did-
more questions out there?
I was wondering if you could comment on the group dynamics that were at the time when you you had programmers team for Activision, and then programmers team for Magic. Was there like cliques and groups of, okay, these programmers kind of a tight group that left, or was it more like?
It was both. It was kind of a combination. See, I was left behind. I was sad. The first group that left was a clique. That was Whitehead and Crane and Miller and Kaplan. And they had basically, within the company, they were called the Fantastic Four because they'd done so much preceding work. I'm coming in 1979. Howard, all these guys are later than me, and I'm fresh out of school. So, I'm picking up, this is the ropes as far as I know, and they laid them all down. So they were kind of cliquish and rather standoffish. Actually, they're different people. Bob Whitehead, really generous, open, sharing person. Some others not quite so nice. But they were a clique. The guys that left for Magic were chosen by one of the marketing jerks, Bill Grubb. Did I say jerk? I'm sorry, Bill. If there's any Bill's
He's not
I
sorry.
apologize.
What did you mean to say?
I meant to say Grubb. and he basically looked at the sales figures and said you, and you. But again, everyone knew everybody
Not
too.
precisely.
Yeah, I mean, there was kind of a group that knew each other, no matter which way you sliced the team. Is what I was
Well,
gonna
really,
say.
Rob Phillip and I were never really close. And Dennis was my supervisor, and Dennis is the one who said, yeah, I want you along.
So there are only 3 exemplars of this process. The Activision guys left actually the Friday before the Monday that I started, so I can't speak to that.
Yeah, I think we filled the wrecks when they left.
When they went off to a Magic, it wasn't like a clique of people, closely knit group.
by the way.
And then the third attempt at that was when Doug Neubauer cycled around with 20th Century Fox and Howard and I, and we're looking at pulling a third set of talent out, and that's the time that I went to management and said, George, I really like working here, but it's starting to cost me money. And that's how we got our compensation improvement.
What, I do want to say though, it was a really sad day for me.
When Bob
I
left.
came in very beginning of '81, and it was Activision had already been established and was out there. When I came there were some remnants of that era, but it was mostly this crew and a number of other people who were there, and there were people I really valued and cared for. And when I heard about Magic, when I heard that Bob and Rob, who may not have been very close to each other, but I felt very close to both of them, and to find out that some of my favorite people were leaving, it hurt me. I mean, it literally I felt bad, just like Rob was saying. I mean, it felt bad to feel like you're losing your friends, but it dropped the environment a little bit. It made it a less cool place to be for the want of some really amazing people. And that was a shame.
Yeah. Wait. Someone else
There
has
was
a
a question over there.
Yeah, you mentioned GCE. What was your relationship with those guys and with the Atari 7800?
That happened completely.
I had no relationship.
So GCC,
Actually, I worked with them.
as I understand it, some of their stockholders were Atari executives, so there's some questionable ethics there, but what the heck. I remember a day in early '82 when management came through and said, okay, make listings of all your games, all of our most sophisticated technology, and send it to the guys in Boston, because we can't make games fast enough, so we're going to have them make games for us. I know that GCC did a thing where they actually were smarter about making products than we were, because they were two people, one game, instead of one man, one game. And the fact of the matter is you can do more with 2 people than with 1, which is the basis of civilization, which is tottering along still. But we had no exposure. They didn't come to us and tell us about the 7800. It just appeared out of thin air. All happening up at
There was a lot of resentment
Sooty
toward
stuff.
GCC in the shop, because when we could get no support, and when Todd went upstairs, for example, I was his office mate, and begged for more memory for Pac-Man, he was told absolutely not. And yet, when GCC comes to the table, here's Ms. Pac-Man, 8K of memory, no questions asked, no problem. Do you want source code sharing? Ours to them. Them to us? Nothing.
Actually, Doug,
It wasn't until later we found out that there was a lot of corporate monkey shines going on, and the people upstairs were making a lot more money off GCC than they were off our labors via Atari.
so for example, we sent all of our source code to them, but when Dave Stogis wanted to do Millipede, he had to disassemble Centipede, which had been done by GCC. It's kind of an asymmetric relationship.
Kind of. And it raised a lot of hackles.
At least there was no bitterness about it, though.
Really, not that much. I was like way too stoned to give a damn.
That was the start of the
Way
late
back
Atari
there.
era, where it became programmers against managers.
Way back?
Me?
Yeah.
To prepare for this convention, I read the book Writing the Beam and the Racing the Beam, I called it, in the last week.
I haven't. Is it any good?
I thought it was very.
I hear it's a fun read, but not very accurate.
There's
If any
some
of you
highlights
guys
of some
read
very
it.
interesting people in that book.
Oh, okay.
I was just going to ask if any of you guys have read it and if it accurately captures what you believe is the development process that you guys went through.
Well, one chapter is absolutely accurate.
I actually haven't read it, but I've seen snippets of it. And there are actually some real technical shortcomings. I mean, he just didn't understand the technology in what he wrote. But hey, what the heck, it was very, very simple stuff, but it happened a long time ago.
The chapter he did on ET is right down the line. I worked with him on that chapter just to make sure nothing, because a lot of times you see people rewrite history very conveniently or whatever, and that's kind of annoying to people who were in it.
Yeah, especially when participants are still alive, folks.
But even what's more
That was
interesting
right on.
is when people who weren't even there and know nothing about it write the history.
But
You
there
got
is
time
an
for just-
example of one piece of media that is done exclusively by people who were actually designers in the whole thing.
Oh, you want to
I
get
think
It's
called
time for-
Once Upon Atari, which is available on GOG.com for download streaming, or OnceUponAtari.com where you could get the DVD. I'm just saying.
I'm just pointing out that Howard did not get filthy rich in the video game business.
We have time for a couple more?
Yeah.
I was just wondering that since there's this big retro game audience now and things like Atari Age, have any of you ever considered going back and making a new 2600 game?
Yes. Funny you should mention that. There's only one person in this whole group that is crazy enough to do that. I will let him speak now.
I decided to, actually, just before Magic went down the tubes, I decided I wanted to write a dungeon for the 2600. Actually, I was working on the 800 at the time, and I was still limited to a cartridge. So I had some time on my hands, so I decided, okay, I'm going to do a 2600 dungeon. So I wrote a 2600 dungeon, and it's going to be sold at the Video Game History Museum, along with the cartridge by Dave Crane, when and if they open, or I shouldn't say if, but when they open. So yes, I have completed one. It was an interesting experience. I didn't take advantage of all the really newfangled abilities that people
Newfangled.
that newfangled, like extra RAM.
Oh,
A little more processing power. So yes, I've done a 2600 cart, and I still love doing 2600. You know, I still know my 6502. EA is a no-op. Yeah.
and Rob misspoke because he's underinformed in this case, because I'm going through and rebuilding tech demos of all my most sophisticated kernels, which is really a lot of fun. And I'm seriously contemplating an Air World. I'm basically the only person in the universe who can write Air World.
Error world.
Error World?
Error world?
Air World, the last of the Swordquest series.
And at this point, it is still 100% air.
Actually, you know, I could never actually figure out how to make the game not suck as much as Swordquest.
I don't know.
And on that note-
I can't see the point of writing carts for such a limited audience. You may think you're a large audience, but you're not. And the bottom line is, you know, the work is hard and it's tedious. And I actually tuned that stupid game, I'll confess. You know, you got to reach a lot of people to make it worthwhile, or it's just a hobby. You know, if 1 million people don't play the game, or at least a large enough number of people that the amount of time I spent playing the game is less, dramatically less than the amount of time they spent playing it, then I'm losing money.
But then again, and this is a conversation Rob and I could have over lunch,
Yeah, no,
I
Rob-
watch a lot of
Rob's
TV.
enjoyable.
I watch a lot of TV. If I just coded on Airworld during the commercials, in 2 or 3 years I'd have a great product.
We should be done now.
Are we over?
We're
Yeah, we're 10:47.
I think we're fine. The young lady down there will flag us.
She'll kick us up. Dave will kick us off
Oh,
the
I-
stage. when he's
Yes,
done.
yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, I'm just interested in hearing about what coding tricks you came up with to keep your games under 4K.
We had coding tricks like you can't believe. I used to use coding tricks in my exam for hiring programmers. I never failed in hiring programmers, by the way. When I finally got to EA, they're like, what are you asking people? Like, how do you swap two registers without using an intermediate? Yeah, exclusive OR, right? Good for you. How do you keep 16 bits worth of pointer and 8 bits worth of space?
Who needs 16 bits worth of pointer and 4
Now, I
bits
had to
worth of
build a
ROM?
linked list. Yeah, well, that was for a later game, actually. That was for Warbirds, by the way. That was not for 2600. But yes, all kinds of tricks. And the other thing we did was what's called squeezing code. When you got toward the end of the project, but you built what you wanted, the emulators would hold like 8K, or maybe more. I think it was 8K. And so you had like, 6K of code. But we could only sell 4K cartridges. So you had to start squeezing the code down. And you'd go through the code. And the weird thing about squeezing code is no matter how many times you squeezed code, you could always get 10% more. It was really quite creepy. So you'd squeeze a piece of code down to 4K 0.5, and you go, I can't find any other way of squeezing things down. And you'd go home for the weekend, and you'd come back on Monday, and hey, wait, I know how I can save another 50 bytes, There's 1%, 2%, pretty soon you save 10%. Well, that's close. Now I only need another, I'm down to 4K 0.05 now, right? I still need more.
Usually the last third of the project was spent
Squeezing
scrunching,
code.
yeah.
I'll give you an example. Once I was in an office with a bunch of people, and a guy coding on a program who was a quite good engineer pulled out a listing and said, I defy you to find a byte of spare code on this.
That was a bad thing to say in that office.
And in that particular case, around the top of a 2-page listing, there was a branch carry clear. And with no other branches, no code that affected the branch, about 2/3 of the way down the listing, there was a set carry. Now I knew that because up above he had branched on carry clear, that the carry was set all the way through that code. So that was a single byte of code that was extraneous. And it took me like 10 seconds to put my finger down here and say, this set carry is not needed.
This is very cool program.
But and here's where it gets tricky. If he'd had to go back and add any code in between, these hundreds of instructions, he might have invalidated and had to go back and add a clear carry again.
This was not approved programming practice. Yeah.
This was totally approved program practice, the only way to get it to 4K.
It was engineering, right? Yogi Berra, I think, has a great quote, one of my favorites. In theory and practice are the same, but in practice they're not.
And on that note, I believe that we should talk with Rick about scheduling a longer talk next year, but I believe that we have consumed the amount of time we have allocated for this room. I hope we've entertained, perhaps slightly informed, and see you next year.
Yeah, we'll be out. Apparently we'll be out there to bullshit at you too, if you want to come around and talk to us later.
And sign things in addition to the bullshit.
Oh yeah, autograph out front.